Hi, welcome to some ideas to use 20 fat quarters. We are up to idea number 4 out of 20, so we're doing pretty well. So we started with 20 fat quarters. I had a nice little stack of fat quarters and I cut them all. So in part 1 we showed you how we cut them. We had a little chart for cutting everything so that a little piece of each of the 20 fat quarters can go into each of the, well, most of them, into the 20 different projects. We had labels so that we could label everything ready for when we get to the appropriate project. So we're now up to idea number 4 and we're going to make this nice little zippered pouch. So it's nicely lined, it's got a zipper, it's got a little tab, it's got a handle, and it would take most likely your tablet, depending on what size your tablet is, of course. You might want to keep a book in it if you like to go out and about and carry a book with you. You might, I'm sure it would fit chocolate in it. Really, we need chocolate in life. There's lots of things you can use a zip pouch for. So what we've got here is, there's a pattern on GourmetQuilter.com under the 2020 Tasty Treats for 20 ideas for 20 fat quarters. And so it tells you in the pattern how to cut all the pieces of fabric that you need for each particular project. So what we've needed for this one was we needed to find piece number, labelled number 4, amongst the ones that we had pre-cut in part 1. We don't need actually all 20 of the pieces. There's 20 different fabrics in the little stack. We only need about 12 of them this time. So we just put the others to one side because we may well be using some of those in a later project. So don't part company with them. So then they're just sewn together. They're just rectangles and they're just sewn together. The pattern tells you how many pieces to cut to go in between with the background fabric into these bands of 2 lots of strips. So I've gone ahead and I've done all that. Also we needed to put a strip on one side, which is this piece here. Then there's a wider strip because this one here folds around to the back. And then this other strip of the piece is on the back. And then there's the other piece that appears to be at the other end, and that folds over and forms this little top piece here as well. So as I said, everything's in the pattern. There's also some information for cutting the piece that we end up using for the handle. So that's just a strip of fabric folded in half and then fold the raw edges into the center and over. And that just needs a couple of lines of sewing just close to the edges, so I'll get to that shortly. We need a piece of batting. I'm suggesting just a lightweight, something like a cotton batting. And then we need something to line the zip pouch with as well. So I've got all of these bits here. So I've joined up my main piece now. So I've laid it on the batting. So what we now need to do is make sure the batting could have been a touch bigger, but I was just using this piece that I had, and it doesn't matter because I'm just going to trim it. It needs to be the same length as our piece there, and so I'm just going to trim it so that it matches at the ends. The sides don't matter at this stage. The ends are what we're after having nice and the same size. So that should now match our piece of lining. So we want to pop the lining piece right sides together with that. It'll be a little bit wider than our outside piece, and that's okay as long as it's the right length. It does need to be the same length. And now we just need to sew that at each end with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll go ahead and do that. Finishing the second side end. So we've got a nice seam on each end there now. So what we want to do now is turn that out the right way, and we'll give that a press on those ends because that's going to be the edge that we're going to sew the zipper into. So when I'm doing something like this, when there's batting and things as well, I often just press it a little bit first, and then I press that over to the back. And we want it pressed so that we don't see the lining, so it should just press along that seam that we've just sewn. And we want to do that at both ends. And so our side edges are a little bit uneven still at this stage, and that's okay because we'll be trimming them before before we need them to be right, but we're not ready for that just yet. So that should all fit really nicely. You shouldn't be seeing any of the lining coming around there. So that's pretty good. So what we want to do now is, if you want to do any quilting on this, and you may want to do some quilting, I've just done very minimal here. I've just gone either side of the two bands of strips, but you may want to do some more in between and here, entirely up to you on that, but you will need to do something. So I'm probably just going to do my minimal amount again, which all I've done is actually stitch about 1/4 inch away from these lines where I joined the patches in. So on this one, and either side of this one. And as I said, if you want to do more in between, now would be the time to do the quilting. So I'll go ahead and do this. So I'm just sewing down either side of this strip that we folded in for the handle and the little tab. And that's just about done now. So I've got my handle and little tab piece. I'm setting that aside for the moment. But I'm just going to trim this. Now that we've done any quilting that we want to do, we can trim up the sides so that they're all nice and even, ready for when we want to sew some side seams. Oops. So I'll do both sides, and then we can put that zipper in. So looking pretty good already. So what's going to happen is, this is going to fold up like this, and this is going to fold down a little bit at the top. This is going to come up here, and we're going to see the zipper teeth exposed just a little bit in there. So what we need to do is sew the zipper onto one side first, and by having a zipper that's longer than it needs to be, it's going to enable us, when we do the second line of sewing, to open it right out and be able to get at it. So that's the reason for the long zipper. We will need to trim it down. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'll probably pop a couple of pins in. You don't really need to pin it particularly, but it's a good idea to have it. You don't want it to be stretching around, so you want to make sure that it's about in the right length of the zipper, because just sometimes things move a little bit, and if the zipper pulls through more, it'll cause it to sort of bend around, and you don't want it doing anything like that. So I've gone ahead and I've got a zipper foot on my machine. I've moved my needle across, which I need to do to be able to use that, and I'm leaving the zipper closed at this stage. So I'm placing this edge, that's that seam edge that we folded over, right next to the zipper teeth, not covering them, but next to, and I'm going to stitch probably approximately 1/8 of an inch away from the edge there. So I'm just going to pop that in there under my zipper foot, which should be set to pretty much sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the foot, and that's because I've moved the needle across to be in that position. So that should just feed through nicely now. So you're stitching fairly close to that edge, and that's okay. The zipper will still work if you stitch close. So that's looking pretty good. So now I'm going to come back and do a second line of stitching, approximately 1/8 of an inch away from that one. So I'll just gauge that so that we're still stitching into the zipper tape, but a little distance away. So there's 2 lines of sewing there on the zipper. So that's sitting in there quite nicely, and you can probably see I've got 2 lines of stitching on the zipper holding it. So it looks nice, it sits nicely, and it holds the zipper nice and firmly. So I think that works really well. I should have mentioned before that when you're deciding which way the zipper goes in, the majority of pouches and things that we use seem to work so that the zipper is from this end pulling across. If you want it to go from the other end, well obviously you're going to turn it round and have it going that way. So for me mostly I'm more comfortable with opening from this end, so that's why I do it that way. So now we need to sew the other part of the zipper in place. So what we need to do now is be a little bit careful about this, because we want these to match, so there's no sort of hoping that it's going to end up in the right place. We actually have to make sure it's going to end in the right place. So we want it to start and finish at the same level, so that when the zipper's stitched in and closed, it's all in the right place. So this time I am going to pin it again, just probably definitely at each end and maybe one in between, so that we can make sure that that is sitting nice and evenly both sides. So now by having that zipper quite a bit longer, I can now get at that really comfortably. If we only had a short zipper, it would be much harder to open that out and stitch it. So now we've got to do exactly the same again. We want that to sit right next to the teeth, just the same, and do the 2 lines of stitching that as we did on the other side. So I'll go ahead and I'll get this started. So remember, we were sewing with that edge up near the teeth and sewing approximately 1/8 of an inch away from that edge. So if your machine has a dual feed like this one does, make sure you're using it for this sort of sewing. It's really helpful. It keeps things feeding through nicely. It's not essential if you don't have one. I've sewn many a zipping without one. However, these new machines often have them. So I'll go ahead and do the second line of sewing, and then I'll show you what we do with it next. So there's my zipper in. I'm really happy with that. That's gone in nicely. I've got the 2 rows of sewing either side. I quite like the colour showing, which is just as well because that's what it's doing. Now we've got the handle and the little tab. So we've got this little handle that comes out at this end and a little tab to hold it when you're pulling the zipper. So we've just made it as one piece at the moment, but we can just chop a bit off one end for the little loop that's going to go on this end of the zipper, and this is going to be the handle. So what we need to do now, whilst this end is still like that, we can just lay this. So I've just folded that over, put the raw edges together, and I'm just going to lay it right over the zipper teeth. Now we can just take it in, depends how much you want sticking out. If you want a bigger amount or a smaller amount, now's the time to make that decision. It should overlap right across the zipper there, because we're just going to stitch it in place just within the seam allowance right across the zipper, and that will contain the zipper as well as putting a little tab in place. So you just want to make sure that you're not stitching through the other side as well. So, but make sure you're only sewing through the top piece with the zipper. So we're not trying to sew too far in, like within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I just like to go back over 2 or 3 times, particularly with the zipper, just to make sure that the zipper's held nice and firm. If you're using a nylon zipper like this one, they're no problem at all to stitch over. And then we can actually cut that off, because we've now firmly fixed right across the zipper teeth there. We can actually trim that level. Woohoo, scary, huh? And that's done. We don't need that piece of zipper. Now this end's a little bit, just a little bit more tricky, because we have to have the zipper open, because otherwise we won't be able to get into it, which means that they're not sitting quite together. So you want to have it done up reasonably close for this part of it, so that they are sitting reasonably well together. And again, we're going to fold this over, and we're going to stitch that right over the zipper teeth. Now this time they're going to want to come apart, so what I found is easier to do is actually to stitch that across first. So if we zipped up fairly close so that when we sew them together it's the right amount of zipper extending there, and those pieces of fabric should be pretty closely lined up. And just stitch over it and back up again, just so that it's held in place, rather than trying to do it all at once with the little handle strap as well. It just gets a little bit hard to hold it all in place and it might move, and you don't really want it to do that. So now I've stitched it fairly close to that edge. Again, I'm just going to let that overlap a little bit. You want it sitting right over the zipper. And the same thing now, we're going to stitch it just like we did the other end. Have all those bits out of the way, have this piece sitting nice and flat, and these sitting nice and flat. Oops. So that when we stitch that across within the seam allowance again, so that we've just got a nice, and again give it a couple of goes backwards and forwards to make sure it's nice and firm. That's looking all pretty good. And again, we can now just trim all of that off. How good is that? That's amazing. We now have a zipper. It's not yet a pouch, it's just a little cylinder. So that's all going to be pretty good. Those are going to sit out when we've done that side seam. So what we need to do now is make sure the zipper is open a reasonable distance, because we need to be able to get in and out of it that way. So probably 2/3 to 3/4 of it should be open. And now we're going to turn it inside out, make sure that the handle is sitting in, and we're going to match up these two insert pieces that we did with those nice colourful strips. Those seams should match on the sides. So this one here, just make sure that inside there it's not going to cause a little pleat where it folds, because of the batting wants it to do that sometimes. So you may want to pop a little pin in just to make sure those seams inside there are matching. And we're going to sew down this side seam. I'll do one at this end as well. So we're going to start at one end. As I said, make sure that's not pleating, so you may need to just encourage that not to pleat, but that basically should be sitting so that there's probably about 1/2 inch or so showing at that end. And we're going to stitch all the way down, and again just make sure it doesn't pleat in the bottom. When there's the batting, it kind of wants to bubble a little bit, but you can encourage it not to bubble. So again, I'm just using my regular 1/4 inch seam allowance and stitching down, and I'm just going to back over the zipper a little bit, just as an extra precaution really, and then all the way down the sides. We've already pinned those so that we know they're going to match pretty well, and then just make sure that it's not bubbling in this little corner down the bottom here. And it's that straightforward. We're going to neaten those seams in a minute. So I'll just quickly show you though, it just gives you that nice point at the top, and you'll have the same thing at the bottom there, and the handle's sitting inside. We're leaving it open. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this side now. I'm going to match those two seams and sew that seam there, and then we're going to neaten it with a zigzag, so I'll show you that. So I'll go ahead and get this done first. So I've gone ahead and I've sewn the second seam. We've still got our zipper open, don't close it yet. So what I'm going to do now is just trim these. So I've only done the 1/4 inch seam, so there's not a lot to trim. I'm not trying to particularly make it small, just sort of tidy, because I'm going to zigzag over those edges so that everything is sitting just really nicely, because it's an exposed seam on the inside there, and I don't really want sort of frayed edges happening. So I'm just trimming off just little edges, nothing really very much. And then I've set my machine up here. I've put a wide foot on so that the needle can swing, and I'm just going to set the zigzag stitch. So the 1/4 inch foot is not a good one for zigzagging, wherever it is, because it does not allow the needle to swing. So you need to have a foot that will let your needle swing, and a zigzag stitch if you have one. And then all I'm just now going to do is overcast those with the zig. So I want the zigzag to go over one side. So that just helps hold that edge nicely then. So I'm just going to go all the way down. And this just gives it a nice little finish. It stops most of the frame, makes it tidy on the inside. So you can see that's quite a nice little edge there now. So I'll just take the little threads off. And so I'll go ahead and do the second side, and then we'll turn it out and do one last little top stitch when I've turned it out. So I finished off the zigzag on both sides. Now we get to turn it out. So much fun. So we just want to push those corners out as well as they're able to go. These top corners are probably just a little bit stiffer because it's so close to the zipper, but they'll come out nicely for you as well. So that's all looking pretty wonderful. Their seams on the sides are looking pretty good. Woohoo! So I'm going to give it a quick press because I think it's a good idea. I like to do a little line of top stitching just near the top edge there. It just helps keep it all flat. It's the only bit I do. I don't need to do any around the other sides. Well, I don't think I do. So I just like to give it a nice press, make sure it's sitting nicely, and then press this top edge so that we can stitch along there. I think it's all looking pretty good actually. So we can have the zip closed. So I'm just going to stitch right through the whole lot, about 1/4 inch in from that top edge, and that just helps give it a nice little finish along that top edge. It's not essential, but it does help it sit nicely. Snip my little threads off, and then something like this, as I said, I would use to keep a book in perhaps. I'd use it to keep maybe a tablet. I have a tablet right here in fact. So you can see that it's going to fit quite a few different tablets. I don't know them all, so I don't know all the sizes. You may find if you're wanting it for a tablet and yours is a different size, you might need to adjust. But overall, that's kind of a nice little way to store something, or as I said, a book and a bar of chocolates. I mean, really, the mind just boggles at all the things that you could fit inside there. So I just thought that was kind of a fun little zippered pouch to include in the series with the fat quarters, because sometimes we've just got small pieces of fabric and we've actually even still got some left ready to go into something else. So that was it for idea number 4, the little zippered pouch. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you, and I will see you again with idea number 5.